Of Nick Faraclas is of Romani, aka Gypsy, and Greek descent. Dr. Nicholas Faraclas is a professor in linguistics at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. Having received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, a National Science Foundation Fellowship, and 2 Fulbright Fellowships, he has developed and taught a wide range of courses and published many books and numerous articles in the areas of theoretical, descriptive, social, and applied linguistics. Over the past 4 decades, he has been conducting research on post-colonial linguistics and colonial era concept languages, as well as promoting community-based literacy activities, in the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the South Pacific. Not in the bio is that he's currently learning Kiswahili in Zanzibar. So yeah, welcome here with us, Prof. Faraclas. The floor is yours.
Well, the honor is completely mine. Thank you to the organizers of this. Just a little story. In this time last year, I wrote some frantic emails to the organizers saying that isn't this supposed to be happening August 2022, but you are so organized that you actually plan these things so far in advance. This is the first time I think that I've ever presented at an event that was so planned so far in advance. So I commend you for all of your efforts, and I also am deeply honored to be here with you. So I was planning to do 2 different presentations today, but let's try with one first and then see how we go. But I think there's a hand up. Was it Musi?
No, I was clapping about the organization part of it. When you said we were organized.
Yeah, no, but this is, I think, a really great forum, and I would like to, if it's possible, invite some of my colleagues to join, but we can talk about that later. In any case, the presentation that I'm going to be making now I would like to dedicate to a colleague, Maria Mies, who just passed away. In any case, I'll talk about that a little bit more during the presentation. Should I just get started? Okay, let me put the PowerPoint on the screen. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes, okay, let's see. Let's do that, yeah, okay. Okay, so the PowerPoint is titled, or the presentation is titled, Longue Durée, Durée profonde, and Decolonial Linguistics in Africa and Beyond. We make the road by walking. Okay, so this is a presentation that was put together by research groups at the University of Puerto Rico, and you can see the names of the people involved here, and then also at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And again, this presentation is dedicated to the life and work of Maria Mies, who just passed away. The slides don't correspond completely with the text as we're going to be reading it. So you may see, I may be saying some things that aren't on the slides, but the most important points are on the slides. Please let me know if there are any technical difficulties, because sometimes the signal here is not very reliable, but let's get going and see how we do. Okay, wandering and wondering along the transitional liminal zones of contact and contingency between the landmass of Eastern Africa and the Indian Ocean, it becomes difficult to ignore the fact that longue durée must be thought of in terms of both time and space. The complex temporal dimensions of longue durée encompass always dynamic and often contradictory continuities that extend from the very first years that hominins, including Homo sapiens, emerged up until the present and into the future, when after centuries of demographic catastrophe due to the trade in the enslaved, the epicenter of the world's population will continue to move ever more rapidly back to Africa. The complex spatial dimensions of Longue Durée encompass always dynamic and often contradictory continuities that extend across rainforests, mountains, deserts, and oceans, none of which ever really constituted significant barriers for our wandering, landborne, and waterborne ancestors. Okay. Stretching all the way to the shores of the Americas and across the Afro-Atlantic to the west, and all the way to the shores of the Americas across the Indo-Pacific to the east. These connections, which also embody disruptions, defy the linear, artificially constrained, hierarchical, monolithic, monodirectional, and monocausal assumptions that underpin the colonial gaze of Western science in general and Western linguistics in particular, with our privileging of a dead, monolithic, idealized, langue compétence over multiplex, real, living, parole, performance, with our obsession with abstract Eurocentric notions about language masquerading as so-called universals, with our family tree models that fetishize variety spoken by armies and hordes of conquering men, with our mission to impose a colonizing order and control over otherwise indeterminate configurations of repertoires by erecting non-existent boundaries between artificially reified individual so-called languages, and by even more dubious extension between corresponding and equally artificially reified individual so-called cultures, so-called ethnicities, so-called identities, etc. Up until now, most of those who have adopted a perspective that takes into account longue durée, mainly historians, have argued that we must begin to consider historical contexts and influences which extend hundreds of years further into the past than is normally the case. That's not good enough. In this contribution, we argue that it is only when we radically extend our notions of longue durée from only hundreds to several hundreds of thousands of years into the past that we can start to make real sense out of the present and begin to envision fulfilling futures for all. As human beings, we have been wandering and wondering over both land and water on this planet for at least 300,000 years. But it's only in the past 10,000 years or so, and beginning only in a few societies, that we've gotten stuck. But what does it mean to get stuck? One way to understand this is through the lens of wandering and wondering. When we turned our backs on wandering, instead of continuing to claim boundless life-seeking sovereignty in and with the entire world, we started to cling to addictive and death-seeking illusions of control, stability, and ownership over enclosed, commodified parcels of territory and fetishized so-called goods. When we turned our backs on wondering, instead of continuing to embrace and engage with the world with boundless life-seeking curiosity and astonishment, we started to lose faith in our own epistemic, creative, and moral sovereignty. Instead, we became addictively enslaved to the words of so-called experts. I have to let somebody in here. Okay, did they get in? Yeah, the so-called experts. First to priests, then academics and scientists, and now to so-called influencers over our so-called smart devices, and all of their seductively deceptive artifice of formulating neatly enclosed, hierarchically ordered, commodified, death-seeking theories of what is true, what is beautiful, what is normal, and what is good, none of which are in our own image and interests, but instead in the image and interest of domination, which, like a cancer, ultimately serves no one and nothing but itself. For most of our ancestors, the process of getting stuck began only in the last few thousand years, as it gradually transmogrified into waves of conquest and colonialism that have now infected every corner of our world like a virus, slowly but inexorably, strangling its host, both colonizer and colonized. Colonialism, in its broadest sense, as radically reformulated by our recently deceased colleague Maria Mies and her associates, can be seen as a many-headed hydra with its inextricably intertwined and co-substantial heads, none of which can be said to have preceded the other, but none of which can be intensified and made more violently normative and ruinously exclusive without making all of the others more violently normative and ruinously exclusive. These predatory and ruinous, yet completely artificial heads are many, and include the insatiable head of plunder, whose latest transfiguration is corporate global capitalism. The inhospitable head of ethnocentrism, whose latest transfiguration is racism, nationalist/religious fundamentalism, and anti-immigrant hysteria. The cruel head of patriarchy, whose latest transfiguration is cis-heterosexism, and the suicidal head of anthropocentrism, whose latest transfiguration is climate change denial, and no doubt others. One of the lessons of the radical reading of Longue Durée that we propose here is that this monster, with all of its very real and disastrous consequences in our lived realities, has no power and reality outside of our faith in it. This monster did not always exist, as we are endlessly told by those whose job it is to convince us that power does not dwell in our own hands, but instead somewhere else. Domination and ruination is not the way it has always been, the way it is, and the way it will always be. If this were so, we would have vanished from the face of the earth long, long ago. Power is not over there and elsewhere. It is right here in us and in the rhizomatic, life-giving networks that we establish and nurture among us, which can be understood as Utu, or Durée profonde, as we will explain later. The enclosure and colonization of our subsistence base, our bodies, our minds, our communities, and our language practices only acquires its false power to the extent that we refuse to acknowledge, claim, and exercise the real sovereign powers that, up until quite recently, were enjoyed by all of our ancestors. The experts, so-called experts, tell us that we are not all scientists, capable of perceiving and understanding our reality and working with it rather than against it to live fulfilling lives as individuals and as communities. And they have done such a thorough job of convincing us that we need someone else to tell us what is real, that millions of people are now committed refusing to be vaccinated against COVID, even though they see the unvaccinated dying right in front of their eyes, all because they have blindly accepted the expert, so-called expert advice of the right-wing conspiracy theorists whose sensationalist voices dominate the social media. At the same time, corporate-sponsored influencers and bots are lulling us into complacency in our false yet addictive comfort zones to commit collective suicide by denying climate change, if not in our thoughts and words, at least in our actions, even as the polar ice caps melt. These so-called experts tell us that we are not poets and artists, and they have done such a thorough job of convincing us that we need someone else to tell us what is creative and beautiful, that we surrender our awesome poetic powers over language and life to the superstars whose words, art, and music are purposefully designed to reduce us to consumers of commodified so-called culture, thus preventing us from becoming the cultural agents that all human beings have been for most of our history on Earth. The experts have done such a thorough job of convincing us that we need someone else to tell us what is good, that hundreds of millions, if not billions of people throughout the world have now surrendered their spiritual lives and moral compasses to the deeply corrupt and immoral hands of profiteering charlatans whose fundamentalist versions of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Hinduism are saturated with ideologies of domination and hatred toward nature and toward all who are gendered as minus cis hetero male, as well as toward all who are raised as plus minus us, and extending to all who are classed as minus chosen by God. Linguists and other scientists in the Western tradition have played a key role in bringing about this apocalyptic state of affairs that is now threatening our very existence on the planet through ever-growing disparities in wealth, accelerating levels of terror, conflict, and violence, and increasingly reversible ecocide. It is no accident that our theoretical linguistics and our theoretical science are based on the worldview of Plato and his disciples, a philosophy that was selected among the dozens of philosophical traditions of ancient Greece as the optimal hegemonic device to justify and weaponize its transformation from a collection of islands and adjacent coastlines into an empire. A philosophy that denies the reality of our physically and socially embodied everyday experience in favor of a universal, hierarchically ordered, monolithic, eternal, unchangeable, so-called realer reality that exists in a realm to which only a class of so-called experts has access, has proved to be maximally effective in transforming all but the chosen few from creators of science, philosophy, art, spirituality, and politics into passive consumers, reliant on and addicted to the authority of so-called experts. By positioning ourselves and or allowing ourselves to be positioned as so-called experts on language, we as linguists have wittingly and or unwittingly usurped and enclosed the epistemic sovereignty to determine what is linguistically real, true, normal, and good, which was enjoyed by all of our ancestors as part of our commons for all but the last few thousand years of the 300,000 year longue durée of human history. While we trivialize and dismiss the work of those linguists who actually let living language speak to them, we glorify the work of so-called serious theorists, whose ultimate goal is to enclose real language by forcing it into a preconceived theoretical framework designed to predict and control it, thereby resisting it to a supposed so-called real or universal system that exists somewhere in an idealized Platonic world beyond the reach of all but us, the initiates with higher degrees in linguistics. In the process, we not only kill language, but we also extinguish humanity's powers over the awesome materiality of language, allowing that awesome materiality to be used against us instead in the interests of domination. The ruined places, time, lives left behind by just a few thousand years of hegemonic attempts by so-called experts to domesticate and control our ways of thinking, speaking, and acting in the world are now to be found strewn across the globe, following wave after wave of colonial invasion and conquest. But among the regions where it is least possible to pretend under the colonial gaze that there are unitary languages, cultures, and identities are those places which have emerged for one reason or another as salient examples of the intense contact among genetic, linguistic, cultural, ethnic, and epistemic repertoires that the study of ancient DNA has revealed to have been the rule rather than the exception for humanity virtually everywhere and always over the last 300,000 years. One such region is the southern coast of Kenya, along the vibrant waterborne corridor of exchange that we have come to know as the Indo-Pacific. Because contact and exchange have been so intense here, the results have been even more difficult and resistant than usual for us to enclose and domesticate in our theoretical straitjackets and neat categories. As one moves from the original sites dedicated to coercive enslavement, such as slave market networks and slave raiding trajectories, and the original sites dedicated to discursive enslavement that are such as the networks and trajectories of Christian and Islamic religious and educational indoctrination, one witnesses an astonishing, and wonderful array of multiplex, pluridirectional, pluricausal, contradictory, palimpsestic, crisscrossing influence of transperformative repertoires. Our intellectual encounters with people from the coast of Kenya before we arrived here began with discussions about Utu, which might be roughly defined as humanity in repertoires that include what has been categorized by linguists as Kiswahili. These discussions of Utu helped us to articulate understandings gifted to us by indigenous peoples in West Africa, the South Pacific, and the Americas concerning the life-seeking knowledges, practices, and sovereignties that have kept us alive and fulfilled as human beings from the first days that we began to wander the earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, and which will continue to keep us all alive and fulfilled until the last step that we will take here. Utu refers, at least in part, to what makes us sovereign beings. That is a deep acknowledgement of the fact that real power lies within ourselves, as well as with our relationships with others. An understanding that resonates with Edouard Glissant's reconceptualization of Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the rhizome to account for the mangrove-like multiplex configurations of linguistic, cultural, and identificational repertoires in the Caribbean, where we are based. While wandering along the southern coast of Kenya, it becomes immediately evident that mangrove forests have played a key role in making this zone a hospitable place for humans to survive and thrive, despite the presence of salt water, which we cannot drink, sand, which we cannot cultivate, and violent storms coming from the sea, which might carry us and our communities away. While floating through the mangroves on the estuaries between Diani and Tiwi, we're reminded of how the rhizomatic image of a mangrove forest is used in Puerto Rico and the rest of the Caribbean to remind us that we are more than just entities or particles, but also relationships or waves. And these relationships extend in all possible directions, just like the roots of mangroves, even upward, to link us inextricably with others in unpredictable ways, so that it's impossible to determine where one mangrove begins and the other ends, or which mangrove has given rise to any other mangrove, thus defying linear notions of time, place, and causality, and commodified notions of separateness and individuality. In Diani to the south of Mombasa, and Bamburi to the north, as well as in the other areas along the Kenyan coast, most impacted by the tourism industry, this life-seeking landscape has been substantially ruined by the destruction of the mangroves and the erection of walls surrounding individual plots of land to exclude access to them. This physical violence and commodification inflicted on a coastline is strikingly similar to the discursive violence and commodification that Western science has inflicted on notions of language, culture, and identity, removing them from their rhizomatic and life-giving matrix of entanglements in order to isolate instances of a singular, artificially reified monolithic language, a singular, artificially reified monolithic culture, a singular, artificially reified monolithic identity. To make things worse, we as linguists inflict further violence on language, draining it of its living, life-seeking, and life-giving powers by performing a monstrous set of alchemical practices on it, analytically burning it until it is dead in order to break it down into its so-called essences or neatly defined categories, binary features, etc. Once we have sufficiently tortured and dissected language, we proceed to use our completely disembodied theories to recombine those essences into a purportedly universal economy of artificial units and processes that are supposed to represent what language supposedly really is in the abstract Platonic realm of mathematical and formal logic, manifested as so-called sufficiently constrained syntactic tree models of so-called universal grammar, or optimality tables purposely constructed according to explicitly violent principles, such as so-called constraint hierarchies and domination. These are the actual words that these theorists use. We had arrived on the coast of Kenya to take part in an event concerning Longue Durée, during which my colleague Angelica Mietzner approached Johnson Mwanzia, a graphic artist from a bit further inland, and asked him to depict in the form of a painting what he understood to be the meaning of udumu, which in Kiswahili dictionaries appears to be the word that might best correspond to longue durée. In any case, what Mwanzia decided to paint was a montage of many of the most important life-giving things that, paraphrasing his words, are already here when we are born and which will still be here when we die. At the center of the painting, the viewer's eye immediately is drawn to a woman carrying a child on her back. Alongside the sun, the moon, and the earth, Mwanzia painted a range of interconnected images depicting a range of activities, all of these activities were related to the commons and the knowledges and practices that we learn mostly from our mothers and grandmothers, which enable us to deal creatively and resourcefully with contingency and to look after the commons while we make use of it to live healthy and fulfilling lives. That is, which enable us to practice subsistence, as this term was also radically reconceptualized by Maria Mies, to whom this presentation is dedicated, and her associates, not as the primitiveness and scarcity associated with it in hegemonic discourse. So subsistence in a radically redefined meaning. In addition to tasks related to our physical subsistence, such as caring for water sources and fetching water and caring for and cultivating the land, Mwanzia represented activities related to our social subsistence, such as service and sharing. The notion of service articulates to some degree what we do to deal with collective contingency in our day-to-day lives, thus allowing ourselves to establish, maintain, and extend our rhizomatic networks of relationships and intermingling with ever-expanding configurations of people, families, communities, and their linguistic, culture, and identificational repertoires. Because we have been wandering and mixing for so much of our time on this planet, and because the success of our species has depended so crucially on our ability to hospitably share and cooperate in the face of contingency, the knowledges and practices which enable us to provide service to one another, which are prototypically associated with and learn from our relationships with our mothers, grandmothers, and other female relations, have become just as important as our physical bodies in making us who we are. Thus, Utu and Udumu can also be seen as the body of knowledges and practices linked to our physically and socially embodied subsistence that have always and will always make it possible for us not only to survive by dealing with contingency, but to thrive. These knowledges and practices differ from one time to another and one place to another, but because they are inclusive, hospitable, life-seeking, and life-giving, they are systematically erased, ignored, and trivialized by the exclusionary, death-seeking systems of domination. Because they are based on sharing and service, they are erased, ignored, and trivialized by capitalism and other systems of accumulation and plunder. Because they are based on openness and networking, they are erased, ignored, and trivialized by racism and other forms of chauvinism and ethnocentrism. Because they are taught to us by our mothers and other female relatives, they are erased, ignored, and trivialized by sexism and other forms of patriarchy. Because they are based on our custodianship of our natural commons, they are erased, ignored, and trivialized by ecocidal notions of development, so-called development, and other forms of anthropocentrism. From the most recently and least colonized indigenous people whose ancestral subsistence base is still largely intact in places where we have lived, such as Futuna in Vanuatu, all the way to the most thoroughly and deeply colonized places where we have lived, such as Los Angeles in the United States. What equips people to deal with contingency and keeps them alive and creating life, even in the midst of the most death-seeking systems, are the rich, deep, thick knowledges and practices exemplified by Utu and Udumu. It is these physically and socially embodied lifeways that make it possible for all of us to do what is important and fulfilling in life. Yet we normally do not acknowledge or valorize them. For example, the labor that most women do to keep all of us healthy and happy is rarely even seen as labor at all, and definitely not compensated as such. And what does this have to do with linguistics? Everything. According to the hierarchical monocausal family tree model, which predominates in historical linguistics, the languages of the conquered women in the Roman Empire have been erased, ignored, and trivialized in relation to the Latin spoken by the conquering soldiers who fathered their children. That's where we get the so-called Romance language group. And it goes further. According to Chomsky's theory of poverty of the stimulus, which predominates in language acquisition studies, or Bickerton's bioprogram and similar so-called universalist theories in creolistics, the years that mothers and other female relatives spend in teaching us language have been erased, ignored, and trivialized in relation to the workings of a hierarchical, monolithic universal grammar, so-called universal grammar, in the child's brain. Because conceptualizations of longue durée have typically replicated linear and evolutionary notions of time, which are exclusively focused on the very brief and recent period in human history that has unfolded since we have gotten stuck in the trap of systems of domination. And because these conceptualizations have effectively erased, ignored, and trivialized Utu, Udumo, and the other knowledges and practices that have made any form of longue durée possible for our species in the first place, our discussions about our experiences on the southern coast of Kenya ended up either complementing mention of longue durée with mention of durée profonde, that is deep durée, or our discussions replaced the former by the latter altogether. So instead of talking about longue durée, we ended up talking about durée profonde. In any case, when we speak of Utu, Udumo, and the physically and socially embedded knowledges that allow us to creatively engage with contingency and live fulfilling lives, durée profonde has proved thus far to be a much richer, thicker, and more satisfying formulation than longue durée. The notion of thickness is useful here, not only because it can encapsulate dynamic and multiplex entanglements across space and time, but also because it goes beyond such notions as Hathaway's concept of the thick present to more fully incorporate indigenous space-times and subsistence knowledges and practices in ways that recognize that we do not have to start from ground zero or resort to further colonizing monstrosities such as the cyborg in the process of healing our sciences and healing ourselves. Going beyond our helpful but still Eurocentric understanding of kairos as opposed to chronos. Durée profonde, like dark matter and dark energy, constitutes the matrix in which we seek, find, and create life wherever we are, be it in an indigenous community which still lives in the abundance of subsistence, be it in communities such as Kinango, where climate change-induced drought has brought people to the brink of starvation, be it in communities such as Tiwi, where the enclosure and invasion of traditional land by corporate and private interests linked to a ruinous tourism industry has made subsistence farming virtually impossible. Be it in urban marketplaces across sub-Saharan Africa, where female control over food and distribution ensure that all of the townspeople have something to eat. Be it in the industrial neighborhoods of Nairobi, where people struggle but manage to get by. Durée profonde is the 1,001 things that all of us everywhere do every day to embrace contingency, survive and thrive, despite the odds stacked against us by death-seeking systems of colonization that are ruining our lives. Durée profonde is the deep reservoir of knowledges and practices of sharing and service that have been gifted to us as part of the commons, which you have been conditioned not to acknowledge consciously, but which guarantee that we make it to the next day of our lives. Once we begin to become conscious of the deep, rich, thick, life-giving, and life-seeking matrix of Durée profonde, by beginning to undo its erasure and invisibilization, not only can we begin the process of remembering and reclaiming the sovereignties enjoyed by all of our ancestors over the longue durée of human existence on the earth, but we can also come to the realization that we have a strong foundation in our day-to-day practice upon which we can build to make the world a better place to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nick Faraclas. I'll now give an opportunity to Professor Makoni, who will first have a conversation with you. Thereafter, I'll open the floor to everyone else. Professor Makoni. Okay, it seems like Prof. Makoni is not available yet. I will now open the floor to everyone else. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please use the chat box, or if you would like to ask a question verbally, please raise your hand and I will call on you to ask a question.
Okay, Mfundo, I'm back. I'm going to get some water.
Oh, okay, thanks. Over to you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks a lot for this presentation. I've got a couple of conceptual issues that I would like to discuss with you first, and then we can open it up to everybody. Is your argument against experts or against expertise?
Yeah, good question. I think this is what I'm arguing there is the construction of a class of experts. In other words, a group of people who are separated from the rest of a community, whose job it is to tell everybody else what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, instead of people assuming their sovereignty to decide based on their embodied existence what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, what is real. And so this is part of how that sovereignty has been usurped. And people have become so addicted to being told what is good, what is real, what is beautiful, that people no longer have or believe in their own sovereignty over those processes and have conceded that sovereignty to that class of experts. So, and so it begins with a class of people like priests, if we go back in time, and priests, all of these functions were embodied in that class in many societies, especially during the very earliest waves of colonization. If we go back to when, say, what was happening in Mesopotamia, what was happening in ancient Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. But eventually, these functions were divided. So the people who tell us what's good remain the priests, but the people who tell us what's true and real are the academics and the scientists. Okay, but this monopoly. Okay, well, just let me back up. The social sciences, though, have to some extent taken over even the function of telling people what's good, because all of the social sciences are totally obsessed with statistics and bell curves. And what are those bell curves? They define a norm, and those norms translate into what people see as good. Okay, so even that function of telling everybody else what's good has been usurped. But now what we are witnessing at present is academics and scientists becoming less and less respected or acknowledged as the class of people who decide for everybody else what's good, real, true, and beautiful. And now this function has been usurped by influencers and different conspiracy theorists, et cetera, et cetera. But we have ourselves to blame because we consciously or unconsciously have allowed ourselves to be, have assumed, either consciously assumed the role of experts or have allowed ourselves to be considered to be experts. And that addiction that people have to that expertise, okay, is what leads people to the point that they're ready to commit mass suicide. They're ready to endorse fascism. They're ready to commit ecocide. So again, it depends on how we define expertise. So looking at that, I would say that if we want to take that definition and expand it and say that when we claim our sovereignty as human beings, and when our ancestors claimed the sovereignty to decide what is good, what is true, what is real, what is beautiful, they maybe embodied that expertise. But the problem is that expertise has been hijacked by a group of experts. So if we could look at expertise from that point of view as well.
Okay. Now, my question is this. I generally am sympathetic towards your argument. That's why I'm trying to nitpick to see where this is going. Is the core of your argument that we should find alternative knowledges, or is the core of your argument that we should know, let's say, linguistics in a different way? I don't know whether the two are different, but I think they are. Is this a question, or is this an argument for alternative knowledge, or is this an argument for creating a basis for knowing, for the need to know in a different way? Then I will follow up from there.
Yes.
Are you trying to say that we should know linguistics in a different way, or what is the story?
I would say all of the above, but then more as well. Okay. So alternative, yes, but when we think of alternatives, often we think of starting from zero. Okay, we have to invent something totally new. But the thing is that all of our ancestors have had this sovereignty. And actually, even though we don't acknowledge it, even though we don't valorize it, how did you survive to wake up this morning. You were using these knowledges that you may have learned from your mother, your grandmother, okay? That we never valorize, we never acknowledge. But these are the things that keep us alive, not these theories that are being peddled by these, by the superstructure of science and the superstructure of linguistics. I put them both together. My critique of linguistics applies to all of Western science. But okay, but then again, there are lots of people within those institutions of Western science that do good science, but they do good science they do good science in spite of the theories, not because of the theories. They go back to their fascination, their astonishment, that astonishment and fascination that all of our ancestors acknowledged and used to scientifically work with nature and work with the world to make the world a better place. So there's all of that in there too. So alternative is a word that can lead us, that may be misunderstood. And so I'm using it in the sense of us basically opening our eyes both to what the wealth of epistemologies,
Okay.
the multiplex epistemologies that are there and still living, especially in the global South, also among indigenous peoples in the parts of the global South that may be located in other parts of the globe, okay, but also those epistemologies that allow people wherever they are, even the most colonized of situations, to survive.
Okay.
So in other words, we don't have to start from ground zero. We are doing it already, except we're doing it without acknowledging it, without valorizing it. So we have a lot of the foundation already there. I'm not saying that we have to go back 300,000 years. I'm not saying that everybody should just start mimicking what this, that, or another indigenous people does in their particular communities. What I'm saying is there are thousands and thousands of points of useful input to what we can put together in our own communities as ways to make the world a better place to live in, and also to reassert our epistemological sovereignty, our epistemic sovereignty. But one other thing I wanted to add is that my critique of Western science, just like I think that interesting distinction that you talked about between expertise and expert, is basically aimed at the theory of Western science,
Okay.
not the practitioners, because there are lots of people doing good stuff, there are lots of people doing good linguistics, but they do it in spite of the theories, and they allow living language to speak to them instead of trying to impose a theoretical work, a theoretical framework on language.
Mm-hmm. So let me continue with my thinking in light of your suggestion. I've managed to survive my life at times, I guess, because of the little knowledge that I have, but it's also because of the nature of the relationship one has with many different people. So if that argument, if that observation, that pedantic observation is correct, your argument then is for the importance of what Escobar would call relational ontology. That the critical aspect there is our relationship with other people. That what scholarship, amongst many other things, should be concerned with is to, if one were to borrow Escobar's term, be seeking to address relational ontology as a way of capturing what Ingersoll would call other waves of knowledge, right? That is the relational nature of our scholarship that is underplayed. So I think that's the impression that I get. For example, the mangrove and all those other things. What they capture is the dense entanglement of human and social relationships. Am I right then to say the underpinning argument you are making is about relational ontology?
Yes, but I think it goes even further than that.
Okay,
And I definitely, okay, yes. So I use a lot of metaphors from physics.
Yes.
Because actually, you know, the people who do good science, the ones who do it in spite of the theory, are now coming to the point where what they are realizing is out there totally undermines the foundations of Western science. And so, especially in physics, but of course in other disciplines as well. So yes, relational ontologies, again, I would liken to the fact that Western science focuses on the particle nature of things, but we are also waves. And that relational aspect, which has been ignored because it's hard to control. In other words, the goal of Western science is to control, predict and control. Okay, it's not about coming to terms with that, with what's out there. And it has been so obsessed with control that in the end, physicists themselves are admitting that Western science, as we know it, can only see 5% of what's out there. The rest they've declared is dark matter and dark energy. 95% of what's out there is dark matter and dark energy. They are admitting that their science is blind to 95% of what's out there because of its obsession, not with coming to terms with what's out there and not letting what's out there speak to them, but by trying to impose a set of enclosures on what's out there in order to control it. So yes, and when we start, but what's interesting to me about these relational ontologies is that they can give us insights into what that dark matter and dark energy might be. Because if you look at the attempts they've made to map dark matter and dark energy, they're webs. They're webs. They're these incredible webs, woven connections, and between everything in the universe. We don't give ourselves permission to see them because of the way we've been educated or miseducated, but under the Western episteme. But they are there, and again they relate everything to everything else, and now it's also becoming more and more accepted that information is never lost. Okay, so could it be that actually it is there in that dark matter and dark energy? So with the relationships are not just with other people that are living, but also with people who have passed and also the people who are coming after us. So all of these insights that many indigenous epistemes have passed down to us are becoming more and more, are becoming less and less distant from what the actual physicists are telling us.
Okay, so basically the core of the argument here is something like what a colleague once said, that nothing exists outside of a relationship to something else, that we are all entangled in each other's relationship. Okay, now let me sum up what you have been saying, and then I'll hand over to Mfundo. A colleague of mine recently wrote in one of our books that across the social sciences, and I think you can add linguistics here, it has been acknowledged that research needs emancipation from hearing only the voices of Western Europe, emancipation from generations of silence, and emancipation from seeing the world in one color only. Right. Yeah, let me stop. Let me emancipate all of you from hearing my voice and hand over to Mfundo. Right.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks a lot.
If anyone would like to ask a question, please do raise your hand, or if you'd like to make a comment or type a question on the chat box, you are also welcome to do so. However, we do have one question on the chat box. Christine Severo first thanks Dr. Nick Faraclas for an inspiring talk, and her question reads as follows. How do you see the linguist's role as spokesperson of the non-human lives whose voices have been erased from the public debate? How can we theoretically and methodologically connect to non-human modes of living and communication?
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Makoni for his questions. Great questions. I think they allowed us to unpack a lot of things. But this question, I think, is really, really important. And again, I think a linguist or any other scientist who does good science or who does good linguistics has to become a child, has to reassume that astonishment, that sense of astonishment, amazement with language. Think of language. Think, just try to imagine what language is, what it represents in terms of an investment of human creativity over 300,000, how many hundred thousands of years of how much time each one of those lives that has been lived before us, that life, many hours of that life, many years of that life were invested in this gift that we're given for free by our mothers and grandmothers, especially because we begin to learn language while we're still inside of our mothers. Think of that, okay? So in other words, this question is an excellent question, but linguists should have been doing this for all of these years, but we haven't been. There are now those linguists who follow the theory haven't been, but those linguists who do good linguists do this. So when someone speaks to us, we should see that what they are saying is not just about something that's happening right now, but there are levels of meaning that embody all of the ancestors and those who are to come. So I think that we don't have to go far, just allow ourselves to open our eyes. Our training as linguists have made us blind to 95% of what language is, just as all Western science is 95% blind to what's out there. Let's open our eyes. And once we are given this gift by the people that we're working with, and people give it to us freely if we acknowledge and valorize this gift, then it's hard to avoid interpretations that involve those who came before us and those who will come after us. Unfortunately, this is not how we're taught to do linguistics by our professors, but in fact, those who do good linguistics really are doing this already. And so I think that what we need to do as linguists is to build on that, build on the good things that linguists are already doing, and make ourselves more and more open to acknowledging and valorizing these other levels of meaning. It's like a proverb, okay? So a proverb is something that you may be told when you're a child, okay? Somebody tells you a proverb, and then you just wonder, what is this nonsense that this person is telling me? Okay, and then when you get a little bit older, you say, I have it figured out now. I know what my grandmother was trying to tell me. Okay, but then about 10 years later, you say, I had it all wrong. And this is really what she was trying to tell me. And then about 10 years later, you realize, no, I had it all wrong. This is what she was trying to tell me. And then on the day that you die, on your deathbed, you realize that you had it all wrong, and that's what she was trying to tell you. But she was telling you all those things, and all those things, those different levels of meaning, represent an incredible investment of all those who come before us, and an incredible investment that we will give to all the people who come after us. So I think, did that help or not? Chris,
Dr. Kristen Severo, oh yes. So we'll move on to the next person. Mari Haneda, you have your hand up. Please ask a question.
Yes, thank you for a very inspiring talk. I have two questions. One is related to what Makoni asked about relational ontology. As I was listening to you talk, it sort of reminded me of what Karen Barras called ethical onto-epistemological positions, because it's not just relational ontology you're talking about. You're talking about opening our eyes to the wealth of epistemologies and ancestors and so forth. So, you know, Barat is coming from a different perspective of physics, feminist new materialism and physics, but is there a similarity between your position and Karen Barat's position? The second question is related to doctoral advising. So it's totally different. But one of my doctoral advisees defended recently, and while I was advising her, I had this conundrum. I think she has her cultural logic of how to organize things, and that was different from sort of Western, you know, rhetoric, right? And you have advised many more doctoral students than I ever had, and I wondered how you sort of navigate or respect your students' Utu and Udemu, am I saying it right? While helping them defend their dissertation. So
two great points. And I purposefully talked about what is real, what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. These were all part of that epistemic sovereignty that our ancestors had. So I think the separation of all of those is another artifact of what the Western, the colonial gaze. And so I think that the more that we join those together, the better. Okay, and like I pointed out, we may think, oh well, you know, we as social scientists, we don't prescribe, we don't tell people what's good, we just describe, we don't prescribe. That's the first thing you learn in your first class in linguistics. In other words, there's this thing called prescriptive linguistics. We don't do that. We do descriptive linguistics, but, and here comes the big contradiction. Okay, as social scientists, we talk about norms, okay? And what is a norm? For most people, that's what's good. In other words, that's what you're supposed to do. So this is a problem. We are being prescriptive. As soon as we get into statistics, as soon as we get into any kind of normative description. So norms basically are the way that people's epistemic sovereignty is usurped, and what you end up with people who live their lives trying to achieve a deliberately unachievable norm. All of these norms that are produced by the social sciences are totally unachievable. Norms are designed to be unachievable. They're designed to keep us all like hamsters on the wheel, trying to achieve this thing that's supposedly the good thing, the beautiful thing, the real thing, the true thing, but actually is not in our image and interest, is reality, beauty, goodness, according to the interests of dominant classes or systems of domination. So yes, the more we can join together these ideas that are sometimes artificially separated into ethics on one hand, different branches of philosophy on the other hand, we have to rejoin them. This is another curse that was of the Greeks on our epistemology. But in any case, the other question, the way that I advise my students is to say, wait, don't, I mean, maybe you were told at some point that to do a good PhD thesis, you have to prove or disprove a theory, you have to formulate a hypothesis. So that's the wrong place to start. Okay, you have interacted with language in one way or another. Maybe you worked with people in a particular community. Maybe there's something else that you did with language. What totally astonished you? What totally amazed you? Start with that. And then where does that amazement come from? Where does that astonishment come from? That will tell you what to do with your dissertation. That will tell you what to do, how to create a PhD that's actually going to be read in 100 years' time, because all of this theoretical junk is not going to be read a century from now. Chomsky will be in the dustbin of history. The people who will be read 100 years from now, the people who actually do good linguistic work, are the ones who have allowed themselves to be astonished, and to take that astonishment and let that astonishment teach them something new about language. And what they're going to learn from that astonishment is something that's rich, like those parables we were talking about, that embody knowledges that are transperformative in terms of time, past, present, future, transperformative in terms of space. So that's my advice to my students. Now, it depends where your position, where you are working as well. So I just happen to be teaching at a university where there's a lot of leeway to do that. I understand that there are people teaching at other universities where there's not that much leeway, but you made it past yesterday. You woke up this morning. That means you are an incredibly resourceful and creative person. Okay, so I have all the faith in the world that you'll find a way, no matter how death-seeking your university is, to create life-seeking and life-giving PhD thesis.
Thank you. And you also clarified my other question about transperformative. So double thank you.
Well, you know, this is something that I have, and I was going to mention in the other presentation, but it's okay. There's a set of new insights that I have gained from acknowledging and valorizing trans contributions to what we're doing. So if you look at language repertoires, okay, and cultural repertoires, identificational repertoires, they resemble subatomic particles, okay? And subatomic particles do these incredible transperformances. So these are particles that go in and out of reality, okay? In other words, they're here now, and then they're gone, and then they're back. And when they come back, they can transform into other particles. So I think this is a very important contribution. We have had very important contributions from feminist scholars like Maria Mies. We've had very important contributions from Marxist scholars. We've had very important contributions from revolutionary scholars in the anti-colonial scholars. But now I think there's another wave of scholarship coming in, and another wave of phenomena that we're dealing with now in our academic work, which is the trans phenomenon. And I think that has a lot to teach us.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Ashraf, you have your hand up. You can go ahead and ask a question.
Thank you very much, Nick, for the useful presentation. I have 3 questions. The first question has to do with Sinfi's question about expertise and the expert. Sinfi actually asked you whether you're focusing on the expert, critiquing the expert, or the expertise. And my question is, are you inviting us to destroy the whole notion of expert and the expert in the field of linguistics or social sciences? And I need also to question the question itself. Can we isolate the concept of the expert from the expertise discourse? Can we have an expert without an expertise discourse within which the identity of the expert is identified? This question is to you and Sinfi as well can come in. The second question is, of course, I can take this point. I can elaborate in this point. To what extent can we abandon the notion of expert and expertise if most of us, if not all of us, are professors in universities, and professorship is defined as a form of expertise. The second question is about the notion of language, which I'm critiquing. John Joseph somewhere argued that folk ideologies are influenced by the academic formulation, academic conception of language. So if you go to the street, you may find the same linguistic or institutional linguistic conception of language, because most of the people on the street actually have been to schools and they picked up the monolithic understanding of language from the schools. So from here, I go to my third question, is, which is, it's about theory. You kept saying that there are some people who do good science despite theory. How do you define theory? And the last question is the Udumu and the Utu praxis. This is one thing which I got from your presentation. It's about relationality. You're inviting us, also Sinfi animated this point about relationality, but not about the genealogy, not about the structure of the practices themselves. Because the trap here is that, as if you're saying, those practices are intact, they're unchanging. If we go 10,000 years back, we find the same practices, as if they were unaffected by the dynamics of the capitalist dynamics. So how to avoid the sensuous trap by asking people to go and think or dig deeper 10,000 years ago? Thank you very much.
Yeah, great questions. Let me start with the last one first. Okay, so it's important that what I was saying is not read that way. It's read that we just go, all we have to do is go back 300,000 years and everything's going to be okay. Okay, first of all, we're doing it right now. Okay, and it's constantly changing, just like those subatomic particles going in and out of existence, turning from one particle into another. This is what we do. Okay, and this is what Udumu and Utu do. Okay, because they're out of control. We as human beings are out of control. And no matter if we, okay, now I'm getting to your second question, even if you go to school, okay, you're still out of control in spite of yourself. Okay, because to survive from one day to the other, you have to break all the laws. You have to break all the rules. Those are death-seeking laws. Those are death-seeking rules. Those are death-seeking theories. Death-seeking theories. Okay, so in order to do good science, you have to do it in spite of the theories. The theories aren't going to help you. They actually get in your way. Okay, and when you look at what people actually do on the street, there's a lot of stuff that comes from school. That's the boring stuff. What's the stuff that excites you? What's the stuff that astonishes you? That's the stuff where you start. That's where good science starts. That's where good linguistics starts. Okay, so then in terms of expert and expertise, all right. I would say that everybody has that sovereignty over what's good, what's beautiful, what's true, what's real. But that doesn't mean that there are some people who may concentrate more on one area than another, and people acknowledge that. So it doesn't mean there won't be some musicians that people would rather listen to than other musicians. It doesn't mean that when people have a problem, they'll go to some people rather than other people, say somebody who specialized in healing, et cetera, okay? But when people set themselves up as a class of experts, that means that the job of healing is relegated to that expert, and you concede your sovereignty to that expert. And when you do that, actually, half of the process of healing is lost, because healing has to be a process that you take sovereignty over. In other words, you take the input of medicine, etc., but you have to be proactive. But a lot of people aren't. They just do whatever the doctor says. Okay, this is a symptom of that sickness. And the same can be said for music and culture, because even though there may be people you prefer to listen to musically than others, okay, what is your role as a listener? Are you co-creating meaning and valorizing and acknowledging your co-creation of meaning with that performer? Or are you just passively consuming that performance? If you're passively consuming that performance, then expert and expertise are extinguishing your sovereignty. But if you are co-creating meaning with that performer, then you are asserting your sovereignty. So there is room for people who specialize in different areas and in that sense have expertise. But as soon as they set themselves up as the silver bullet, just like our theorists set themselves up as the people who can tell you how everything works, and they have a simple explanation for everything, and the theory of everything, Chomsky's universal grammar, in other words, one answer to all your questions. That's the kind of addictive, death-seeking illusion that's being peddled by death-seeking science. Yeah, so did that answer your questions, or were there some things that I left?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does. Thank you. Lots of thanks.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another two questions. First from Dr. Michael Scott and Deboho. So Michael Scott's question reads as follows. Asante sana, Dr. Faraclas. As a non-linguistic and fledgling learner of Kiswahili and Lingala, I am enthused your profound engagement with Utu, Udumu, and by extension, Ubuntu. As a loyal participant in this African Studies Forum, I believe we all here share your enthusiasm for this exploration. I wonder to what extent such discovery is launched by immersion in Bantu languages and Kiswahili, and in Kiswahili's case, most notably, their ability to incorporate their rhizomic mangrove-like linkages into their own richness of expression and social dynamics. Related to that, how can we move from studying such discoveries as academics or experts to become activists who bring our shared appreciation to the so-called real world beyond our individual and collective ivory towers?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So part of this goes back to something that was mentioned in the previous question that I didn't talk about very much. But let's start with the last aspect first. So of this question. So basically, okay, my main work actually is not linguistics. I spend more time doing community work and also work that promotes for platforms for people who are doing interesting work related to the languages, cultures, and literatures of what we call the Greater Caribbean, that is the Afro-Atlantic. So that's what, that's the way that, that's the kind of activism that I've been doing over these years. In terms of community work, it's been focused partly on the use of children's the language repertoires that children have in their homes, in the schools as well. So children are given an opportunity to valorize their own linguistic repertoires, their own cultural repertoires, their own identificational repertoires in school, as well as to learn skills such as reading and writing in the language that they know the best, and then using the first principle of education, which is going from the known to the unknown. So that's part of the work that I did in Nigeria, part of the work I did in Papua New Guinea, and then the work that I'm doing in the Caribbean and Latin America now. But that was mainly centered around work with children. But with adults, basically the kind of literacy work we have been doing in our programs is critical literacy work. So in other words, not about any kind of literacy that's necessarily attached to one particular linguistic repertoire or another, but more or less treating life as a text and reading and writing life in the Paulo Freirean sort of understanding of that. Reading and writing the world, reading and writing life. So that is my personal way of doing this, okay? But I would say that, and the way that I got involved in that was actually beginning to interact with communities. So, so basically, when I arrived in Nigeria in 1980, I had a grant to go to Nigeria. Okay, so I had, in order to get that grant, I had to, you know, elaborate a very detailed research agenda. So, but I had a history before that of working in many different social movements, primarily in the US. Anti-imperialist movements, anti-racist movements, feminist movements, LGBTQ movements, et cetera, so anti-capitalist movements. So I knew that this is not a way to do any meaningful work. So as soon as I got to Nigeria, I just threw it away. I threw my agenda away. I was supposed to be working on Nigerian Pidgin. I was supposed to be working on Nigerian Pidgin. I went to the university. The professor there asked me, okay, what's your agenda? I said, no agenda. And so she said, well, I have this community in the Delta who want somebody to come there and help them to set up a school for the children to learn to read and write in their own language. So that's what I did. I went there and I learned that particular language. And but in the process, of course, I learned Naija. But I learned Naija through an African language, not through English, okay, which gave me a whole other perspective on Naija. So in other words, using this kind of approach, let the community speak to you and follow the direction the community wants to take you. Let the language speak to you and follow the direction that the language wants to take you. So those are that's, to me, those are the ways that that we can do these things. And I would say that, yes, in terms of your other question about so-called Bantu languages and Kiswahili, actually, I would say that the majority of the languages spoken in the world today have many of these same characteristics that you are recognizing there. And so, not to take away from Kiswahili, or from Bantu languages. But I would say that if you actually position yourself in the way that I just mentioned, then you will find this in every language that you study. And it could be even in the most colonized of situations. So you have people who are working in very, very colonized communities as well, who have actually begun with a positioning of allowing the community to call the shots and allowing the language to call the shots. Let the language speak to you, let the community speak to you, and then moving in that direction. And I think this gets back to the question that I didn't answer from the last time. How do we as professors do this? We are questioning ideas of expertise and expert. And so I think that when we are dealing with our students, we have to realize what is the student that is in front of us represents what they represent. And they represent such a wealth of knowledges, such a wealth of understandings that we never have had access to. So in other words, if we do the same thing with our students and begin there, then I think that this allows us to at least upend this whole positioning of professor and expert that is always going to position us if we don't position ourselves in another way. So yeah, so I don't know, was that helpful?
That was truly inspirational. Thank you so much. Very comprehensive and very inspiring. So, and I can relate to that from my own background to some extent, but it really ties together everything very well in your presentation. Thank you. Asante sana.
Karibu sana. Kamwe.
Thank you.
I'll now take the last question from Debejo, and then I'll hand over to Professor Makoni to make his closing remarks. Thereafter, Phoebe will announce our next speaker, and then we will head over to our after-party session, which will not be recorded. So Debejo asks, so first he thanks you for this presentation in relation to thinking of transformation. So his question, reads as follows. My question arises from impact of artificial intelligence and its change of all aspects of knowledge. Can you project the impact of AI in linguistics?
Yeah, we are coming to the point now. Well, actually, at the beginning of this conversation, people were asking me, what is my approach to learning Swahili? And of course, given the conditions with COVID and the fact that I am 69 years old and I have underlying health conditions, I have to limit the amount of actual face-to-face contact that I can make with people. Also, I just arrived in Zanzibar just a few weeks ago. I'll be here till September, but there's a lot of learning that I did before. But I found that using the telephone was a very useful way to begin to learn Swahili. And so, yes, there's a role for it, but it's very, it can lead us into a very deceptive and a very nihilistic sort of pessimistic trap. So there are a lot of people who think, well, you know, it's not going to be a long time before machines can do whatever humans do in terms of language. And I think that's totally false. Okay, now this thing seems so powerful and so fascinating because it's a very dim reflection of that 95% that's out there. That 95% that's out there of dark energy and dark matter, that's a web. That's a web, but it's much richer than anything that could ever be contained by this thing. Okay, but because we are blind to that 95%, because we believe that that 5% is all there is to understand and know, because that's what we are told. If you believe that, then you are doomed to believe that this thing is eventually going to replace you. Okay, so it's so important that we recognize the fact that the thing that created this, the science that created this, okay, was within the straitjacket of a theoretical superstructure that is blind to 95% of what is out there. Okay, so if we begin to, like good scientists do, to open our eyes and our ears and all of our senses and all of our understandings to the other 95% of what's out there, that is the stuff about language, for example, that astonishes us. That's the 95%. Okay, and learn from that. That puts us in touch with those incredibly transperformative layers of meaning and unenclosed, uncontrolled, and infinitely constantly changing and infinitely diverse multi-logs, not just dialogues, but multi-logs between and among all kinds of texts and all kinds of people and all kinds of speakers and listeners, etc. Then that pessimism that this is eventually going to replace us is totally without foundation. So yes, AI can help us with some things, like with language learning, but like when we talk, like any of the discourses that we use around sovereignty, okay, indigenous peoples, traditional peoples, for 300,000 years, our ancestors were not closed off. They were not Luddites. Okay, we survive on this planet because for 300,000 years we've been open. We've been relating with other people, relating with other knowledges, constantly. That's what's kept us here. That's what's made us survive on this planet, is that openness, okay, that hospitality, but hospitality at an epistemic level as well. And so that is what a lot of what we're talking about now, but it's about maintaining that openness and maintaining that sovereignty. But one of the elements of that openness is when something new comes, when a new knowledge comes, when some new people come into the community, you are hospitable, you're open, but you retain your sovereignty. When something new comes into your life, if it can give you something good, you accept it, but you accept it as long as you remain sovereign over this thing. And this thing doesn't become sovereign over you. It's about control. And the thing is, because we are addicted to experts, because we're addicted to somebody else telling us what's good, what's true, what's real, then when this thing comes into our life, 9 times out of 10, we become addicted to this thing, and this thing becomes sovereign over us instead of us remaining sovereign over this thing. And that is the real danger of artificial intelligence. It's about us conceding our sovereignty, and how we've been conditioned by the idea of experts to concede our sovereignty to somebody else, to let somebody else tell us what's good, real, beautiful, true. And there are a lot of people who are now depending on this thing to tell them what's good, real, true, and beautiful. And they've become totally addicted to it. And I think that is extremely dangerous in terms of the rise of fascism, the rise of the positioning, the total concession of sovereignty that is allowing fascism to rear its ugly head in the way it is now. I think we're at a really, really interesting point in history, a really crucial point in history in terms of whether these kinds of forums will even exist in the future, whether they will be outlawed by people who don't want people to say anything that may upend or threaten any of these systems of domination. That's really what we're up against. And if we don't retain our sovereignty over AI, then AI will be used in the interest of domination rather than in our own image and interests.
Okay, I'm gonna take the last question from Desmond, and then I'm gonna hand over back to you, Prof. Makoni. So Desmond, first, thanks you for this brilliant and courageous insight. His question reads as follows. You echo a struggle I have shared in this forum about our risky entanglement with expertise. If I understood you correctly, would it be the case that just like women who continue to regenerate and renew biologically and culturally, irrespective of how they are valued, there are people outside of so-called Western science who approach reality with awe and seek to live one with rather than dominate reality? If this is correct, there are ways we can easily identify and better engage with such individuals in terms beyond those dictated by Western episteme. Hints to this is already in your comments. Hints to this is already in your comments here, but I hope you can say more from your personal experience.
Okay.
Mfundo, is it okay if I just mention something quickly?
Yes.
Please.
Okay. Just to clarify, thank you again. I appreciate the hopefulness and the optimism that you echo here in the face of what seems terrifying and dismal. My question really is about, how would you guide anyone who wants to engage with the people who are already living that hopefulness, who are not living a life dictated by Western science, just like the reference you made with women and the way that they continue to regenerate the possibilities of life. So outside of Western institutions, where can one go and hopefully engage with people a bit more fluidly on these productive terms? Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. This is a great question. So just an example to start off with. All right, we are the news, the discourse that is saturating our lives right now is centered around these climatic catastrophes, for example, and the way that we're not killing the planet, we're killing our ability to to survive on the planet's going to be here, but we won't if we keep going the way we are. Okay. And so, and then, okay, so there's that. Then there are people who are so concerned about violence and inter-ethnic violence, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and then we have this whole class of experts. We have this whole class of consultants. It's a whole mafia of consultants about bilingualism, intercultural relations, blah, blah, blah. We have a whole class of experts on environmentalism, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. We have all these mega, we call them bingos, big international NGOs like World Wildlife Fund, et cetera, who are supposedly the experts in all of these areas. Okay, but where in the world have people maintained the oceans, the wildlife, the forests, et cetera, for tens of thousands of years, and they're still doing it, okay? Maybe we could learn something from them instead of a consultant that you're paying from who is born and educated or miseducated in a country where they've totally trashed their environment, who are the so-called experts. Where is the expertise there, okay? So here's an interesting division between expert and expertise. The experts are these consultants, but the people with the real expertise on the ground of how to do this are in Vanuatu, for example. I still work in Vanuatu. I worked in the South Pacific from 1986 to 2002. I was based in Papua New Guinea, but I worked in the other Melanesian countries as well. Okay, so there are these, so in other words, there are lots of these communities, but there are thousands of them. Okay, so and there are thousands of linguistic repertoires and thousands of identification repertoires, thousands of cultural repertoires. Linguists say that Vanuatu has per capita the most languages in the world, about 129 languages for 300,000 people. Okay, but each of those artificially reified languages represents an artificially reified ethnicity, but each of those artificially reified ethnicities at least has a different approach to this. Okay, so it's not like there's just one way. There are thousands of ways out there, but nobody's listening. Okay, nobody is paying attention. Nobody is acknowledging or valorizing how they do it in their particular place. Yet these consultants who are actually have been educated by a system that's destroyed our ecosystem are the ones who are being given all the attention, being paid all this money. And of course, we know what the dynamics are behind all of that. Okay, but well, let's talk a little bit about language and culture. Okay, so the experts on multilingualism are mainly from Canada, the US, people who worked in Canada because they have two languages in Canada, English and French, so they must know everything about multilingualism, bilingualism. And in the US, they had some kind of bilingual education, although given the brutal butchering that's happened in the United States of any kind of program that could even resemble any kind of multicultural education, that's gone. But in any case, the paid consultants, the experts are there. But go to any village that I know of in West Africa, or any village that I know of in the South Pacific, and you ask people, those people over there, where did they come from? Oh, they came from over there. They're the place where they used to live, the desert encroached on their land, and they came here. And they live here with us now. And you might have 8 or 10 or 12 groups in that village, all of whom were welcomed, but were welcomed with sovereignty. So every year, each one of those groups, okay, sets aside a piece of their harvest to symbolically demonstrate to the people who are there before them to thank them for welcoming them into their place. So in terms of understandings of cosmopolitanisms, understandings of inter-ethnic conviviality, okay? The worst place you can go is the United States or Canada or Western Europe. The people who have the expertise are living in those villages, but nobody is even thinking about asking them, how do they do it? How do they pull it off? Not in the search of like the answer or the magic bullet, because as soon as you get into that, there's only one answer, one magic bullet, then that defeats the whole purpose. But there are thousands of people who found answers to these questions, thousands of communities. And those communities deserve some acknowledgement, some valorization, and deserve to be heard to teach us about the ways that this can happen. Of course, it's going to be different in each community and each place. So yeah, so I think that is a way to begin. But please don't forget that these knowledges are here with us right now today. So you are not going to wake up tomorrow morning unless you exercise these knowledges. Okay, that's what keeps us alive. All this other stuff is all of these other systems out there are death-seeking systems. All the rules that they make are death-seeking rules. Okay, but we survive to the next day, which means we must be doing something right. But the things that we're doing right, we don't acknowledge, we don't valorize. We think, well, that's just the way I get by. No, it's much more important than that. That is durée profonde. but it's what we've been conditioned not to see, like we've been conditioned not to see 95% of what's out there, and we just brush it off as, well, it's dark matter, dark energy, we can't see it, so it's not important.
Okay, I would now like to hand over to Professor Makoni to make his final remarks, and then we'll head to our after party session. Prof. Makoni.
It's frozen.
It's frozen.
Let me turn off my, maybe there's something here.
Well, my computer is old. It needs a lot of alternative knowledges. Nick, thanks a lot for the presentation and the optimism that it engenders. I think what we have learned from what you are talking about is the need to be able to utilize the current networks and levels of knowledges that we have got to create alternative paradigms that can help us do the work that we are doing. Because we can't get there, whatever that there is, using the existing frameworks, because the existing frameworks simply make our situations even much more difficult. Right. Thank you very much. Let me give over to Phoebe to tell us who is coming next.